Okay, I think we will get started. Welcome, everybody. My name is Jonathan Doe. I'm the general editor of Journal of Management Studies, and this is our inaugural JMS Dialogues webinar. This is a new innovation of the journal, so we're trying something new, and we're really delighted that you're all able to join us here today. By way of introduction, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about this idea of JMS Dialogues. So first, Journal of Management Studies is, we believe, one of the leading general management journals. It's been around for more than half a century. Like all general management journals, we publish various types of contributions, regular, empirical, and theoretical articles. We also have an essay format. But I think one of the more innovative things in the journal, which other journals have now followed along with, is our point-counterpoint exchanges. We call them PCPs for short in the journal. And these are essentially debates or discussions, dialogues around a theoretical challenge or issue, an empirical quandary, some conflict or disagreement in the academic environment about something related to research. So they really take on a lot of different topics and formats, but it occurred to us that they lend themselves well to a lively debate and discussion. And so this JMS Dialogues series really grew out of the PCPs and an acknowledgement that perhaps we could take the published point counterpoints, and a little later on I'll put in the chat area or the Q&A area a link to these particular contributions. They lend themselves well to an online format of discussion and debate and dialogue. So in the PCPs, in addition to the point and counterpoint, we also typically have an introduction from the handling editor, in this case me. So I'm going to share just a couple perspectives or commentary, if you will, about this topic before we turn things over to our main event, which is the point and the counterpoint. And the first one, which if you're an international business scholar is nothing new to you, and that is that distance is a really fundamental construct in international business and international management research. It is pervasive. It is something that comes up in a lot of different contexts and a lot of different settings and environments. It's ubiquitous. It's ubiquitous in our research. And I just draw your attention to one example in the current environment where countries and companies are battling COVID-19. Distance, both literal geographic distance, but also culture and institutional distance, seem to be shaping in one way or another the responses that governments and organizations have had to COVID. So right here and now, we see evidence that this topic, this notion of distance has relevance. But it's also been something that's been somewhat criticized for a variety of reasons, and I won't get into them all because that's part of the gist of what our point and counterpoint presenters are going to touch on. But one criticism is that it's just been applied too broadly, that it's been used in too many different ways, in too many different settings, and maybe is losing some of its theoretical structure and theoretical salience, if you will. Now, in my introduction to this point counterpoint, I'll go back to the origins of international business, which some of us might trace to economic geography generally and location theory in particular. And distance was a very important construct in that very early research that integrated geography and trade. And it had to do with distance between markets and towns and agricultural production areas. And so scholars were very interested in trying to understand the configuration of geography and how that affected the way that market exchanges take place in trade. Now, of course, much later, we had Hofstede, who brought our attention to cultural differences, and then later yet, an application of these cultural differences, or now distance, in the legendary, if you will, Oded and Singh article and measure. But again, it's been applied to and defined in a lot of different ways. Some would say too many different ways, and we're going to hear more about that from our point counterpoints here today. So the points and counterpoints are going to draw attention to some of the shortcomings and, if you will, limitations in this distance construct, and make some suggestions about how it might be enhanced using this notion of diversity and thinking about ways to provide both greater precision and greater relevance of this distance construct. And so the order of presentations here today will be the point, which will be presented by Fabrice Lumineau and his colleagues. And then we'll hear the counterpoint from Tatiana and Sjoerd. And then we have a legend in and of itself, Oded Shenkar, to provide some discussing comments. And then we'll open things up to Q&A. And I will be tracking the Q&A as we move along, and I'll try to consolidate or integrate some of the questions as they come up, so that when we get to the Q&A, rather than read 20 or 30 different questions, I'll try to bring together and see if there's some common threads. So feel free to throw anything in the Q&A as it occurs to you, but certainly as we near the end of the 3 presentations. So without further ado, let me turn things over to Fabrice and his colleagues to give us the point being why diversity is a way to enrich and really strengthen the distance concept. Welcome, Fabrice.
Thank you, Jonathan. All right, so first of all, I would like to thank our editor, Jonathan Doe, and JMS for organizing these events, Tatiana, Kostova, and Sjoerd Beugelsdijk for engaging in interesting debates, Oded Shenkar for serving as discussant today, as well as all the participants. My name is Fabrice Lumineau. I'm currently at Purdue University, and I will start in about 3 weeks as professor in strategic management at the University of Hong Kong. I'm going to give you an overview of a recent paper with Marvin Hanisch from the University of Groningen and Olivier Wurtz from the University of Vaasa, where we look at international management as management of diversity. As mentioned by Jonathan, the notion of distance is at the heart of international business and international management. As famously noted by Axarier, we could even consider international management as management of distance. As you know, there has been a proliferation of research on different types of distance, including, for instance, cultural, linguistic, regulatory, administrative, political, institutional, geographic, or economic differences between entities. A number of influential scholars have called for a clearer conceptual framework. For instance, Ambos and Atkinson observe that a surprisingly small number of empirical and conceptual studies have taken up the challenge to develop new and theoretically sounder conceptualizations. Dow pointed out the need to shift from exploring whether distance matters to understanding why and how it matters. And indeed, overall, there has been an insufficient attention to the mechanisms through which distance operates. So the starting point of our paper is that the construct of distance in IB and IM carries very different meanings and is tied to different mechanisms. So let me use an example to illustrate how the concept of distance has become increasingly convoluted over the years as researchers have attempted to extend existing research. In many papers, you see a reference to either positive or negative effects of distance. For instance, Reus and Lament, in their JIPS 2009 article, contrasted very different ideas and mechanisms tied to the same overarching constructs. And to be sure here, we are not singling out a specific paper. We are simply offering an illustration of a common practice. So on the one hand, they suggest that distance can lead to considerable clashes about what is considered appropriate behavior, increasing the likelihood of conflict and mistrust, which induce a negative effect of distance. On the other hand, in the article, distance also presents opportunities to realize learning and combine more diverse viewpoints, would support a positive effect of distance. So one of our key motivations when starting this project was, can we avoid such conflicting arguments by using more precise terminology that is closely aligned with the distinct mechanisms? In other words, can we better understand the intrinsic ambivalence of distance and reconcile the debates over the influence of distance by providing a more nuanced perspective on the mechanisms at play instead of using the single umbrella term of distance? Specifically, we argue that important opportunities are overlooked because of the way distance has traditionally been conceptualized. Our initial observation is that research on distance and diversity have largely developed independently. And this is surprising, given the conceptual overlap and proximity of problems that these two streams of research address. Indeed, both streams of research study the same phenomenon, that is, differences between entities. We though propose to leverage the literature on diversity to use a framework helping us better decipher IB phenomena. Specifically, we drew upon research on diversity to apply the distinction between separation, variety, and disparity to IB research. So following Harrison and Klein, we distinguished three main mechanisms of diversity relevant to organizational research. First, separation, that is differences in attitudes, values, or opinions among unit members. Then variety, that is differences in types or categories, primarily of information, knowledge, or experience among unit members. And third, disparity, that is differences in the concentration of valued social assets or resources among unit members. What we explain in the paper in detail is that separation mostly refers to friction, in line with Oded Shenkar 2001, while variety is mostly a source of enrichment, and disparity usually induces inequality. So while understanding that the influence of distance at the institutional level is central to IB research, with its interest in cross-national differences, we emphasize that relevant sources of diversity for many topics in IB originate not only at the institutional level, but also at the individual and organizational level. So let's take our introductory example of the article by Reus and Lamont about cultural distance in the context of mergers and acquisitions. If you look closely, you notice that this paper used a construct, national culture, situated at the macro level, to explain a phenomenon, M&As, situated at the meso level, proposing a mechanism, individual behavior, situated at the micro level. So we suggest that we can develop more precise arguments by clearly articulating the level at which diversity matters and the level at which it affects outcomes. We next discuss the meaning of separation, variety, and disparity at the individual, organizational, and individual level, which yields 9 distinct combinations. By drawing on the diversity literature, we disentangle different types of distance and their underlying mechanisms by differentiating among separation, variety, and disparity. To illustrate again through our initial example, instead of just talking about the negative or positive aspects of distance, we could refer to the specific notions of separation and variety. So our framework opens practical opportunities of studying differences across entities. So in the paper, we provide detailed examples for each cell of this framework, and we highlight potential avenues for future research on topics that are central to IB research. It allows us to specify distinct mechanisms that are often conflated under the broad term of distance and better identify at which levels those differences operate. In other words, our diversity lens helps us understand the intrinsic ambivalence of distance and reconcile the debates about the influence of distance by providing a more nuanced perspective on the mechanisms at play. So we believe our approach has 3 main advantages. Firstly, we can reconcile the apparent incompatibility between distance as a liability, that is the implicit focus on distance as separation, or as an advantage, that is a focus on distance as variety. Secondly, it allows to extend the analysis of distance by considering multiple levels of analysis, pointing out that distance can originate at the institutional, organizational, and/or individual level, and impact outcomes at each of these levels of analysis. And thirdly, it expands ambivalent aspects of distance and makes conceptual distinctions that lays the foundation for a more rigorous investigation of differences across entities. Though our study departs from and extends the current literature on distance in 3 major ways, our theoretical contribution provides a more precise analysis of underlying theoretical mechanisms, that is why certain outcomes are affected, a clearer identification of relevant context, that is which outcomes are affected, and a better understanding of expected effects, that is whether outcomes are affected in positive or negative ways. In sum, we propose an alternative framework to the traditional analysis of distance, which remains parsimonious and supports a better understanding of the mechanisms at play when analyzing differences across entities. So if you want to know more, I invite you to read our article, which is now in open access on the JMS website. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Fabrice. You got us off to a wonderful start. I think bringing up some really challenging and important questions, and I look forward to having some further exchange on it. But we now want to return to the counterpoint, and Tatiana Kostova is going to lead us there in providing an alternative way of thinking about distance and diversity in international business. So Tatiana, over to you.
Jonathan, can you allow me to share, please?
Joe, do we have a setting on there somehow that maybe we're not letting Tatiana share here?
Fabrice needs to stop sharing his screen. There we go.
There we go.
Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, thank you everybody for attending this debate or this dialogue that JMS is organizing. Thank you to the Point team, to Fabrice, Olivier, and Marvin for initiating this project, and to JMS and Jonathan for supporting it. Like most mainstream IB scholars, Sjoerd and I have worked with distance for, between the two of us, several decades. I started working on distance in the early 90s, and we have followed the literature. So we were very excited about this opportunity to engage in this dialogue. We recently did a couple of review projects with Sjoerd and other colleagues on the two main types of distance that have been used in the IB literature, the cultural and institutional distance, and they appear in JOM and JIPS respectively. And what we found, and we were very impressed with our extensive review of the literature, is that our community collectively and cumulatively has developed a very robust literature on distance. There is a lot of work done, hundreds and hundreds of papers, many scholars who have engaged with this construct. As Jonathan explained, it's a major kind of almost field-defining construct in international business, and this explains the interest. There have been many points of critique, which we actually found that most of them have been addressed somewhat by scholars in the IB community, including the critique that our distinguished discussant, Oded Shenkar, raised 20 years ago, believe it or not. But just to refresh your memory, Oded talked about several illusions in the literature on distance and several assumptions that this literature takes, and raising all of this as critique to the distance construct and its use in international business. When we reviewed the literature, we found that almost all of this have been addressed somewhat. Maybe not to our complete satisfaction, but there has been very much, a lot of attention to the distance construct. So what we are doing today is addressing one of the remaining critique in the literature, which concerns the intra-country heterogeneity, which initially the distance literature kind of assumed that countries can be viewed as homogeneous internally. Our approach, however, is a little more on the conservative side and the traditional side. We appreciate and build on the existing literature. We keep the distance construct at the country level. We believe this is the most defining level for international business. We recognize that the literature can be enriched and strengthened further by incorporating additional literatures, additional theories. And we also want to go beyond critique in this article to provide some very concrete ideas and insights and recommendations of how to theoretically incorporate intra-country diversity into the study of distance, and finally to provide some empirical and methodological advice on how to do this. So in this context, we thought about how to study diversity and how to add diversity to the study of distance. And we decided to introduce this new construct, which is called intracountry diversity. To define diversity, we relied on literatures from the team, literature and management, psychology, and so on. And we also define diversity in terms of two dimensions: degree of diversity and pattern of diversity, recognizing that it's not a 0 and 1 construct. There is a range of diversity which can be considered in a particular country, and also it comes in different shapes. These three illustrations kind of show the different types of diversity that you will see in real societies, in real countries: homogeneous, diverse but very clustered in well-defined subgroupings, and diffuse diversity societies. Intuitively, this idea of usefulness, idea of diversity and the construct of intra-country diversity makes sense. It allows us to move from the traditional view of distance as comparing means between two countries to more complicated and sophisticated and we would say realistic kind of depiction of the overlaps and the differences between societies. So moving away from mean differences to the values that we share and that divide us makes sense. Also, we argue in the paper that using the construct of intra-country diversity will add specificity to the research because of this well-defined dimensions of degree and pattern, and it will enhance theorizing in our research on distance because it links to literatures that diversity is linked to, like the diversity theory in management, the literature on fault lines, which is essential in our studies, the literature on tight and loose cultures, which is also very important for international business. And finally, this construct allows us to formalize contextual complexity. If you think about diversity, it's not only one country that is diverse. The distance is by definition a dyadic construct. So recognizing all the different types of diversity in these two countries and the combinations of diversity can be more easily done if we incorporate the construct of intracultural diversity. In the paper, we provide two examples of very classic traditional research questions and research streams in IB. Liability of foreigners and legitimacy of multinational companies and cross-border transfer of practices. And we develop propositions to illustrate how theoretically we can incorporate ICD into these models. We also provide a methodology or suggest a methodology for calculating, measuring diversity with the cultural overlap index based on Cohen's D. All these details are in the paper or available upon request, which allows us to calculate distances based on this overlap measure that accounts for the diversity in each of the countries in the DAD. And we conclude our paper with some practical guidelines. This was one of our intentions in the very beginning on how to incorporate diversity and distance. We basically suggest three scenarios in distance research. The first, when the countries are pretty homogeneous, and then we don't have to account for diversity. We can proceed with the traditional classical measurements and theorizing on distance. The third scenario is the other extreme, when societies are so diffuse and so fragmented and so clustered that it doesn't really make sense to kind of look at distance as something important, of major importance or consequence for business. And finally, the majority of the cases we think will be in scenario 2, where we have to accommodate diversity. We have to enrich our theoretical models and also account empirically for diversity in our studies so that we produce more reliable and valid outcomes. So in any of these cases, we have to start the analysis of the intra-country diversity to decide on the proper level of analysis to decide on the proper approach to measurement, traditional versus overlap, and to decide if additional theoretical extensions and modifications are necessary. To conclude, we are kind of optimistic about the state of the distance literature. We see a lot of activity, a lot of good ideas. We are also want to stay practical and kind of find the balance between complexity and rigor on the one hand and practicality and feasibility on the other hand. We want to keep the literature not confusing, build on it as it exists, but enrich it with new ideas and new methodologies. And we're also talking with Sjoerd and other colleagues about exciting new opportunities for future research on diversity and distance. Jonathan mentioned a couple of them in his introduction, but they're fascinating things that are brought to the forefront recently that might impact our work in this area and international business in general. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Tatiana. Nicely done in terms of summarizing a lot of contributions that you make in the paper. So thank you for that. Thank you, Sjoerd, for that. So now we have the opportunity to hear from a discussant, very distinguished IB scholar who's especially known for his work in cultural distance, but he's going to comment on what we've heard from the point and the counterpoint, while also perhaps sharing some of his own perspectives in his own research, such as a recent JIBS piece that he had discussing this topic. So Oded, delighted to have you here. Glad you could join us. Over to you.
Okay, Jonathan, thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me well. First of all, kudos to the Journal of Management Studies that indeed, as Jonathan said, has a long tradition of attacking sometimes topics that have been either neglected or have not been looked upon in in depth. So that's wonderful, and thank you for that. Briefly, I mean, I definitely enjoyed both papers. I mean, of Fabrice and his colleagues, and then of Tatiana, each of which is trying to go beyond where we are, which is obviously a good thing. And I will connect to some of the points I've made in a minute, but let me first say that what I will present maybe is not the traditional role of a discussant, but I have titled it Counterpoint. As some of you may know, I mean, I've been challenging this notion that international business is the management of distance. I mean, I believe the distance is definitely a useful, but only one of multiple lenses with which we need to look at the field. I also happen to believe the distance overall is the wrong metaphor with which to look at cultural differences. I've tried to talk a little bit about it in our original 2001 paper, but then we did an AMR in 2008 trying to expand on that. And that really goes back to how you see IB. I do not believe that the IB is only about economics. I do not believe that international business started with Heimer. I suppose that a lot of what I do has to do with my own biases and background in area studies and in sociology, looking at how people like, Max Weber have looked at the world and comparative civilization and so forth. The one thing that I was really intrigued by, I mean, it was obviously not maybe the main focus today, but is this potential connection between cultural differences as we discussed them in IB and the whole notion of diversity. There is, I believe, a very clear contact. I can tell you, at least from my own personal experience, it's a very tough sell. I mean, years ago, I've already appealed to at the time we had Associate Dean for Diversity to say that our own research is relevant and so forth, to no avail. Now, perhaps when diversity takes center stage, people will realize that our field actually is very well placed look at some of those issues. If you talk about economics, I mean, cultural differences in economics, and again, I'm oversimplifying, of course, but generally speaking, cultural differences are considered bad. This is at least in the way that they have been applied in international business. If you look at the Jean-Francois initial application of, transaction cost economics and so forth. The issue is that if you look at the diversity perception, cultural difference can also be useful. And I've looked at the variety of field, and I increasingly try to take seriously our claim that we are really an interdisciplinary field. And then you really have evidence pointing in both directions. Now, when you see that, when you find such inconsistency, the question is, what's next? What's next to me is looking at the contingency, looking at the condition under which we will get the positive or the negative, repercussions. So we have indeed, as you have mentioned, a recent JIPS paper that tried to look at that and borrows from a number of fields, including psychology and organization behavior, something that is called contact theory, that tries to explain when an encounter will be positive or negative. Admittedly, they're doing it within cultural diversity, but we can also do it obviously within the nation. And I definitely applaud Tatiana for looking at that. If you ask about my own research, so we have a recent a paper that's supposed to appear in the forthcoming issue of Strategy Science, where we look at M&A we take within culture perspective. We look at different cultural region, if you will, within China. And indeed, we find that cultural differences can have positive or negative implication. Again, where we are as a field, I would say, is to identify under what condition this will be produced. I should add just a word of terminology, since Fabrice mentioned, like the notion of friction. We use it in a little bit of a different sense. We look at friction as something neutral. We don't look at it as something negative, even though there's sometimes the implication, linguistic implication. So this is really the approach that you take in physics or mechanical engineering, where a contact can be a negative. It's definitely a negative in engineering in terms of generating heat and slowing processes and so forth, but it can also be a positive. And the best example I always go back to is this of the car tires. Right? I mean, if you have no friction on your tires, you have a problem, right? So there is a certain midpoint where you possibly can get the benefit without paying too much in cost. So I think that there is a lot that can be done. And again, I think both Fabrice and Tatiana and the co-author have pointed ways to do that. I would, again, though, also encourage us to look for alternative ways. And I'm not saying that distance is not useful, even though, to me, cultural distance as a construct, as an aggregate construct, should not be used anymore. I think it is patently wrong. But distance as a whole is not something that we should rule out. But again, I don't think it should be the only lens. I think we should aspire to develop multiple lenses on that. And I also think, again, that we have an opportunity today to really be current when everyone is talking about diversity. We are a field that has been talking about diversity for a very long time. And the national and the in-country definitely cross-cut if you think about, for instance, Hispanic population in the US and so forth. So let me stop here and back to you, Jonathan.
Thank you so much, Oded. You've given us a lot to think about, and I think your comments were nicely complementary that is complementary with an E as well as with an I to both the previous presentations. We've got a couple questions going here. And as I said, what I'm going to do is maybe elaborate and integrate a bit. So we had a question that came in the chat having to do with the relevance of using country level measures to explain firm level phenomenon. And I'm actually going to pose this question to Tatiana and Sjoerd, because I think your response to Fabrice and colleagues was that, number one, IB has already gone a long way in resolving some of the critiques and criticisms of the distance construct, and you laid out sort of how it's done so. And there are other ways of addressing them through this intra-company approach, intra-country approach, pardon me. But Fabrice and colleagues kind of take things one step further to look at organizations as well. And given the fact that it is sometimes difficult to discern what is a national cultural effect from an organizational cultural effect, how would you respond that your counterpoint here doesn't really acknowledge or incorporate the kind of the organizational perspective? And maybe the answer is that's not IB. Maybe once you get down to the organizational differences, that's OB or that's somebody else. But I'd be curious about how you'd respond.
Okay, Sjoerd, do you want to go or should I?
Oh, please go ahead, Tatiana.
Okay, well, what Jonathan said in his last sentence would have been my answer, that with the notion of distance, the construct of distance in our literature, we are trying to capture the country level effects. Yes, organizations are different, and management scholars have studied organizational cultures and relationships and trust and social capital and so on between organizations. But essentially in IB, with the distance construct, we are capturing this country level effect. We can add the others, but they will be something different. This is my first point. And the second point is the distance construct is absolutely important in international business because it captures the contextual embeddedness of organizations. We cannot talk about multinational companies or companies in international business if we don't kind of recognize and don't account for this contextual effects, this contextual embeddedness. That's very important. That's defining for us as a field, and it's also very relevant. Look at any two companies that come from different countries. On top of all organizational issues and challenges, you will have a very substantial set of challenges that are caused by contextual differences between the two countries. It can be culture, it can be institutions, it can be legal situations, it can be politics nowadays, very powerful, but this can be captured at the country level, and I think it's very important for IB to keep this focus.
Thank you, Tatiana. Actually, we had another question come in that I'm going to use as a follow-up because I think it addresses a similar challenge, but now in a more practical setting. The question was, for countries with diffused cultures, what would be the most appropriate level of analysis or studies on cross-border M&A? But I would also throw back in, when we look at cross-border M&A, can we really tease out what are the national cultural clashes or challenges or problems versus what the organizational cultural challenges or clashes are? I would say that's hard. That's hard. So back to you, Tatiana, in short.
Maybe short?
Yeah, if I can chip in. Whenever it concerns the discussion between the national level and the organizational level, I'm especially in the context of cultural differences, so organizational versus national cultural differences, I'm always reminded of the single paper that has empirically tried to address these two constructs, and which goes back to the Hofstadian work in ASQ 1990. And fairly recently, I actually tried to look for follow-up. And the problem is that there's no real follow-up, large-scale follow-up of, at least that I'm not aware of work that has tried to tease out the national cultural effect of the organizational cultural effect. So that's an agenda that is, I think, fairly open still. That's one of the things where also where we were going when Tatiana were preparing. and we were going through Oded Shenkar's famous lists of assumptions and illusions, it's one of the things where we really had a question mark. So what has been going on there? I might be forgetting critical things that I may have missed, but I think that's still open territory. The one thing, the critical thing that I see, and that's also a bullet that we included in our presentation and that Tatiana alluded to, was that at the end of the day, distance is input in trying to understand what firms do. And what firms do has to do with contextual differences. So to us, I think I can safely say us, it has always been a way to understand firm behavior. So when you provocatively said, Jonathan, the OB that's something else and we don't do that, I think we do that, but always with the back in our minds, we always have this idea that firms in different parts of the world, even if they're in the same industry, if they have the same product or service that they offer, they tend to be organized or managed differently. And these contextual differences matter, especially if these firms start to cross borders. So distance is a tool. It's part of the toolkit.
Thank you, Sjoerd. Helpful. I'm going to turn things
Jonathan,
back over.
can I add something on that very
Please,
quickly?
go ahead, Oded, please.
Fabrice is 100% correct. I mean, I did a study with two of my colleagues that looked simultaneously at national and corporate culture. That was in Management Science 1996. Okay, so that was at the time when, you know, we looked at Hofstadter work, and I've been talking to him, and there was really a hope that something will come up. But there was no continuity, so people may want to see it as an opportunity. Second, very quick comment on what Tatiana has said, which is absolutely right. Firms are embedded in context, in national context, but they're not necessarily embedded in the same way. And one of the points that I tried to make previously was that, for instance, an M&A, culturally speaking, is very different than a joint venture, and that a hostile acquisition is still different because the kind of embedment that you get in national context is very different. So I rest.
Thank you, Oded.
Thank you.
Thank you, Oded. Appreciate that. That's helpful. Sometimes we are revisiting issues that have already been well visited. We've got a couple questions that came in earlier that I'm going to direct towards Fabrice and his colleagues. And Fabrice, you did such a nice short synopsis of your paper. When you brought the matrix up, you nicely illustrated where you think IB currently is. And then you had a number of the cells where we're not and we should be. And so one of the questions had to do with the porous nature potentially of some of those cells and the fact that hybrid organizations might actually transcend cells. But I would add to that question, what are some of the opportunities? What are some of the topics that we're missing in IB that we might be able to begin to take a look at if we relax this sort of somewhat rigid assumption in your view about what distance is and what distance is not? I realize that's a big question, so maybe you and your colleagues can ponder it a moment, but what about the specific case first about the hybrid organizations?
Well, I think it's a good question. I mean, to keep the model tractable, what we discuss in the paper is to discuss like specific examples and illustration and opportunities for each cell of the framework. But there agrees that in practice, when you think, for instance, at an international joint venture, you have cross-national differences, corporate cultural differences, maybe also individual differences. But I think one of the main points of the paper is to illustrate that there are different sources of differences across entities. It's important to look at the different sources and also in practice also to look at the possible interplay between different sources of differences, especially when you think at, again, like IGVs, international alliances, and many other IB phenomena. I don't know if Marvin or Olivier, you would like to extend on that?
And maybe if you had a chance to think about what are some of the missing topics or subjects or foci that we might be able to now turn our gaze at that we haven't because we've had this more limited perception about what is IB and what is distance.
May I jump in? Yeah, I think one other thing, and the discussion also until now reflect that to a certain extent, is the focus on cultural distance, which, if we apply the diversity framework, relates to what is called separations, so difference in attitudes, in values, and so on. And so what we believe is that there are very interesting areas of studies to focus more on cases where we can speak about variety or disparity within the area and the realm of international business. And it's been done to a certain extent. So we have there are some examples, but compared with what has been done in the area of separation, there are we believe, wide area for research there, for instance.
Right, thank you, Olivier. So we had I'm really stimulated by these questions, and I'm going to kind of bounce around a little bit. I'm going to try to connect to some things that have already been said. But one attendee asked, can our IB line of research be combined with OB research on gender diversity? Could we take gender diversity to a national level or take national level diversity to a firm level? So here again, I think we have a little bit of pushback, if you will, that we can kind of fully disentangle the national level differences from the, say, firm level. And then in a moment, I'm also going to ask you about individual level, because that's not something that has come up much. But maybe just sticking with the question about gender diversity and thinking about extrapolating from gender diversity research in OB to a higher level of analysis, or moving in the opposite direction. And I guess that's, I don't know if that's for Tatiana and Sjoerd or Fabrice and others, but.
Maybe me, Jonathan. I'm the
Okay.
only woman on the panel.
Start there.
Kidding aside, but if I look at the issue of gender diversity from my lens, from research from 25 plus years, I would approach it as an institutional distance question, because this is an issue, this is kind of a very specific issue that countries differ on. And you can look at regulations about gender diversity and gender differences in a particular society and compare those regulations across countries. You can look at cognitions that are different, cognitive institutions in different countries, and compare those taken for granted assumptions about the gender roles and stereotypes and so on. And you can look at it from a normative cultural perspective. What are the social norms with regard to gender diversity? So the institutional approach or institutional distance provides a very clear kind of path towards capturing this gender diversity in our research. We can study gender diversity issues, for example, the gender diversity agenda of multinational companies in different countries, or of companies in different countries, and they will be contextually influenced by those regulations, by those social cognitions, and by those social norms and cultures. That's one approach. I'm sure that other people have different views on this, but it's very straightforward. It's similar to what we do with issues of corporate social responsibility, or we do with issues of environmental protection, or with governance models and everything else.
Thank you, Tatiana. I'm going to pull a question that I think is a little bit of a follow-up, and I'll try to articulate how it's a follow-up. The question is, could we expect that spillover effects of MNCs in emerging countries will be affected by the distance between the two countries? So a multinational in country A that is more similar may have more or less spillover effects or linkages, however you want to call it, versus country B that is more distance. Again, linking the multinationals, kind of the cultural boundary spanner here. Is this something you thought about, Tatiana? And it occurs to me that it may relate to some of your research in CSR and legitimacy, but I'm not sure.
Well, definitely spillovers work, and spillovers are possible at all levels. And I didn't quite understand the specific question, but.
So I think the question was that if a multinational is operating in a country with more substantial cultural differences from its home, might that prevent or facilitate more spillover effects, be they CSR or otherwise?
backwards to the multinational company home country, or spill over from the company to the environment?
I think they mean to the company, from the company in the host
company
to the
environment. Yeah, and there is a lot of research on this, like the social implications, the social consequences of bringing in a different culture, a different set of practices to a host country. It doesn't have to be an emerging market, right? It can be a developed market, and multinational companies coming to the US, for example, where I am, can have a spillover effect on institutions in the host country. I'll give you a quick example of BMW and Siemens, German companies that are located, they are operating in the Carolinas, South and North Carolina. They had a profound effect on the professional training. They are working, they created a network of educational institutions, technical colleges and other colleges in the region and high schools in the region to implement, to transfer this practice of apprenticeship from Germany to the US. We didn't have apprenticeship before that pretty much. And with this spillover, this is a spillover. So big differences can create opportunities, as many of you have suggested, and it's quite exciting. And we just finished a paper on the role of the Chinese diaspora in Russia for Russian firms, and we see the same spillover effect from Chinese diasporans, representatives of the Chinese business community, who bring technological knowledge, institutional knowledge, cultural knowledge, and a lot of skills to Russian companies.
Thanks, Tatiana. I have another question here from Steve Tallman, which I'm going to direct at you, Oded. And I think I know what your answer is going to be, but let's see. The question has to do with whether the whole concept of home host analysis still makes sense, given the fact that multinationals have these overlapping global networks. It's not this dyadic relationship between headquarters and subsidiary. It's this whole constellation of relationships. So does it even make sense to continue to think about home and host as the two kind of pull and push of distance or other constructs in IB?
Good question. First of all, just to follow up very quickly, I mean, on Tatiana's points, in terms of the spillover and so forth, again, we have a paper, SMJ at the time, that looked at with Chang Wang Li and a few other people looking at cultural attractiveness, basically saying where a foreign culture may deem attractive and therefore you want to imitate it. And possibly the example that she gives on, say, German engineering, might be in place. So again, we shouldn't be too mechanistic and just say, let's measure the cultural distance between the two. Now, to Steve's point, yes, this is a very good question. I mean, where is a country domicile? You can get 3 or 4 different answers. I mean, there is a question of where it is listed. There is work in finance on multiple listing, for instance. There is the tax domicile. This is where the actual headquarters is. And boy, this is becoming much more complicated now with all kind of virtual thing and talks about change in the in the tax code and so forth, right? US IP are located in Ireland and this and that. So yes, we should absolutely. I'm not saying discard this home host, but again, not be captive to the original dichotomy that was indeed very useful at the time. It was useful at the time when we talked about GNP rather than GDP, right? When everything was kind of looked upon from a very simplistic nationalist perspective, and that was true for the time. So absolutely, we have to kind of go back to the drawing board, be dynamic. But again, the good news for IB, I think that we are way better placed to do that than other fields, including those sometimes say, I'll be a sniper strategy. They think that they are no longer needed because we are all living in this wonderful global paradise.
Thank you, Oded. I'm gonna wrap a couple questions together here, but I'm gonna preface it by an observation. So I recently completed a review paper on multinational non-market strategy with some colleagues, and it was just accepted to JIBS last week. And one of the things we found was within the multinational non-market research, but really in IB more broadly, we rarely look at the individual level of analysis. And Ricardo Flores a while back made the comment about whether perhaps Fabrice and colleagues and Tatiana and Sjoerd are speaking to two different audiences. The former speaking to international management, the latter speaking to international business. So he's suggesting that international business is more kind of country level driven, international management is more organizational driven. But I would add an additional observation is that we see precious little micro level studies in IB. Very occasionally do we see people looking at individuals. We sometimes see teams research, but a lot of that we had seen in IB in the past seems to have gravitated back to its allied social science, OB or sociology, whatever else you want to consider. So that's just an observation. But to Fabrice and Olivier and Marvin, could you talk a little bit about what your framework might do for us when we start thinking not just about countries and organizations, but about individuals, either literally an individual or groups of individuals?
Well, I think there are many opportunities to further study individuals in IB. Like you look at what's going on, for instance, in strategic management. There has been a big push over the last 10 years, like to further study the micro foundations of some macro level phenomena. And I think it's the same in IB. I think we still have a lot to do to further integrate, especially the diversity of individuals into IB questions. And we provide like some examples in the paper about how, for instance, you can understand like the composition of a team and how it can influence some decisions at the more macro level, and especially at the international level. So I think whereas the point and counterpoint papers converge is that it's important to further understand like different sources of differences. So it can be at the national level, like what Tatiana and Sjoerd do very nicely, or it can also be at the organizational level or even at the individual level. And even if it would be like even more complicated, like we could imagine also like multi-level studies looking at the individual influence, at the organizational influence, and also the cross-national influences.
Thank you, Fabrice. Marvin, Olivier, anything to add?
Well, I think maybe one minor point that you could add to the discussion is if you think at the original cultural distance idea, it was essentially an aggregation of individual level values, beliefs, attitudes to a macro level. And I think one contribution of our framework is that it allows us to disaggregate from that macro level and really go to the individual level again, where it actually originated from. So I think, we're going back to the roots of the original problem. And if you think about team composition and international teams, that's still a very prevalent topic. Now, look at our panel today. It's very diverse and it's very international. And I think, our framework may help to understand the dynamics that unfold in such a setting.
Thank you. Thank you, Marvin. Appreciate that point. I've kind of a specific question, I think, for Tatiana and Sjoerd about the ICD construct. And the question is, should it be, or does it necessarily need to be limited to cultural diversity? Could it also be used for other types of diversity like gender, age, deep level diversity, et cetera, et cetera? So might your ICD construct have yet broader potential?
Sure.
Yeah, yes, the short answer is yes. So we take the opportunity in the paper to explain it and to embed it in the discussion on cultural distance. But we make clear and we explain in the paper itself that it can be applied much broader. There's one remark I wanted to make regarding the discussion on levels of analysis. I think one of the classic challenges we have in IB is we have the ambition to combine these different levels of analysis, and a couple of years we had this wave of studies that said, everything is multi-level by nature, so we should use multi-level methods. And that's all true. I mean, it's hard to say that this is wrong. At the same time, if you think in terms of practical terms, it's really challenging to collect data on the individual level in multiple firms across countries. Now, there's tools like meta-analysis where you combine different individual studies from different countries and they can be done at the individual level. So there's ways around it, but I think it's a major challenge in terms of practicalities to try to collect data on the individual level, embedded in firms, embedded in countries or regions within countries, if you think about diversity within countries. So it's not easy. If it would have been easy, it would have been done already.
Got it. Got it.
But if I may add one very brief comment with regard to the previous question and also related to what Sjoerd suggested about the micro level, about the individual level and the micro foundations of distance. Remember the studies on psychic distance? Basically, in our view, and we have been talking about this with Sjoerd, it is kind of taking the national differences and bringing them down to the individual level of how people feel about another country. Are they kind of comfortable? Is there this psychic comfort of going to another market? And this is where it started. So I'm just throwing this in as an alternative way to think about the micro foundations of distance, because it affects all of this cultural, institutional, legal, political, and so on, differences between countries. At the end, they boil down to forming, shaping different perceptions and points of tension and points of concerns and worries when managers make decisions about going. This is also a micro foundation, as opposed to just simply looking at different individual attributes.
Thank you, Tatiana. I've got another one here that I've been pondering over because I'm not sure I fully understand it, but I'm going to read it slowly. And Oded, I think I'm going to send this your way. The question is a twofold question. The first part of it is, according to Zahir, one of the most important criticisms of distance relies on the consideration of the lack of distance, which cannot be simply interpreted that two countries are close. So maybe I'll just stop there. What's your comment regarding that criticism? That saying that there's not distance means that two countries are close doesn't really capture an important or salient insight. Do you agree or disagree with that, Oded?
Are we talking about cultural distance, other type of distance?
I think the reference is more to cultural distance.
Well, I'm not sure what if I interpret it correctly. However, we just been talking about, like the importance of the individual. There is some evidence that people tend to neglect differences that they see as relatively minor, okay? I can tell you from, if I'm looking, say, at Ford, the company that pays for some of my upkeep here at Ohio State, Ford actually, I know that they invested a lot in building their relationship with Mazda at the time. It goes back to the early 1970s, realizing that you talk about a very different culture and so forth. But at the same time, they had a fairly bad debacle with a UK-based company headquartered in Scotland that I'm not privy to talk about, but my impression was exactly that. The assumption was, how different can it be, from us? So there is some evidence to that. Having said that, I'm not sure that that was what the question was about. But again, it is a reminder that we should not look at things in a very kind of mechanistic, linear fashion, because the evidence simply does not support it.
Thank you, Oded. We're starting to near the end of our time here. I'm going to ask one more question and request that not everybody answer it because we won't have time for that. So maybe one from each team. And it has to do with something Oded mentioned earlier, and that is the metaphor itself. One of the questioners asks whether cultural or institutional fit might be, or lack thereof, might be a better metaphor, or to quote Pankaj Gemawat, perhaps difference, because distance, I do think, has a bit of a negative connotation, right? It's something to be overcome when we think about practically. Whereas fit probably has the other connotation. It looks at the compatibility. Difference, I think, is pretty neutral. So maybe I could just ask very quickly, and I think maybe the answer is already in the papers themselves, but Fabrice and colleagues, might you prefer fit or difference over distance if you had a chance to rewind 20 or 30 years of research and start afresh?
Well, I think difference is a good term. And actually, when we prepare the paper and when we review the literature, when we look at the actual definition of distance, in many papers, it's about differences. And quite surprisingly or not, actually, when you also look at papers on diversity, it's often defined as differences. So both journals of research actually refer to the term differences. So it might not be that a bad term.
Thank you. Without stretching this out too long, I'm gonna hit short on this one. You all are pretty comfortable with distance. You're okay with distance. Am I right about that?
Yeah, but there's one, if there's one takeaway, I think, of this debate, the discussion or dialogue that we're having, is that it's a plea to look into the underlying mechanisms. So the idea to, and I'm referring back to Oded's remark, to blindly in a mechanical way apply the distance framework. That's something that the two pieces really share. And that I think hopefully we have been able to articulate in this session today.
Excellent. And Oded, I think you've already shown your stripes here. You would prefer something other than distance, but would difference be acceptable to you, or don't you care that much?
Well, I do care. Devoted quite a few years to that. I mean, okay, as a generic term, I'd rather use differences. I stopped using distance. I try to use. I myself offered friction, as I said, neutrally defined, but there may be definitely other ways to look at it. My point was and remains that whether people buy into friction model or not, there should stop looking at the issue from, again, a very, very narrow perspective, but go back to the drawing board and look for more useful lenses, or at the very least additional lenses, as opposed to what we have been doing now, which in many ways was simply a product of the I would say the seductive nature of having one very, very simplistic formula that supposedly solve any cross-cultural puzzle out there.
Thank you. So I wanted to just leave the group with a couple final thoughts. First, of course, I want to thank our presenters. I thought they did a marvelous job in summarizing their main arguments, and then even better yet, I think, in engaging in the discussion, which I think was really, really rich. I'm trying to share my slideshow and it's not working for me now, and I'm not sure why. Are you seeing my slides at all?
Yes.
Anybody?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, we can see them.
Okay, but I'm not. Anyway, so my closing observation here is a bigger question. I think it's a bigger question, maybe not, but it's a question related to what is IB? What is IB? Is IB really about cross-national border interactions? I think both groups have already said it's more than that. But if we look at the aims and scope in our journals, and we look at the recent papers are rejected, a desk rejected often from IB journals, it's because they're either not cross-border or they're not cross-border enough. I'm sorry, I'm gonna stop sharing again and see if I can get this better. Are you seeing my screen now? Yes, okay, good.
Yes, we are, yeah.
All right, good, thank you. So my final comment here, well, of course the technological problems are gonna occur in my closing thoughts here. One more time. And it's something that we've seen a little bit of debate on in IB, but I think not enough. And I think it's time that we really address this issue head on. And if we're gonna redefine or broaden or remove some of the constraints, we should be a bit more explicit about it and not kind of dodge the issue. And I think this whole question about whether diversity is a more appropriate lens through which to view cross-national and other differences I think helps us move in that direction. So I leave the panelists in the audience with a thought, a reflection, if you will, which is, are we defining IB appropriately? And if not, do we need to maybe direct some time and energy in redefining it in a way that is more reflective of the realities? And of course, the subcentral issue, the subnational issue, is just one of the many other approaches that we might take to think about IB. Finally, I think we got off to a great start here today, other than my little problem sharing slides. And we've got another point counterpoint. This actually came into the journal prior to the point counterpoint on distance, but we took a quick look back and we said, well, this is a great topic for a JMS dialogue. So 1 month from now, we will be featuring a point counterpoint on the future of the corporation. If there's not a bigger question than that, I don't know what is. And we've got some really dynamic and exciting people to debate that question. Colin Mayer, who many of you know, who has a particular view of the corporation and maybe even redefining the corporation. And Jerry Davis probably has an even broader view that it's not just about the corporation, it's about capitalism itself. And if you've ever seen Jerry or Colin go at it, it's a real treat. And then we've got a star-studded cast, as we had today with Oded, of discussants, in this case 2, Paul Collier and Jennifer Howard-Grenville. So please do join us on May 20th. Also, I think at a decent time, if you will, for both Europeans and North Americans. Apologies to those of you who joined us from Asia. I know it's not very conducive to your time zone. So I want to once again thank the panelists, the presenters. I was really merciless with them on the front end about offering very short, focused presentations, but that allowed us 35, 40 minutes of dialogue. And I think we covered almost every question that came in the Q&A in one fashion or another. So thank you all again. Please join us again for the JMS Dialogue series in a month, and we'll have some in the future, probably not over the summer. We'll probably wait to the fall. And also thanks to the point counterpoint. And most importantly, read the actual papers. They're all open access right now. So they're all available to you. So take a look at the specific arguments that each group makes. I think you're going to be really impressed, as I was, and I'm sure you were today at the presentations. So thanks again to all. Have a good rest of your day and rest of your week. Thanks to Joanne Cheseltine from our team for helping pull this all together. And we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you, everyone. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everyone.